October 19th, 1942. The morning sun climbed high over Guadalcanal as American pilots made their way toward their waiting aircraft. They settled into the cockpits of their F-6F Hellcats, machines that had become the subject of bitter jokes in every ready room across the Pacific. Ground crews called them flying tractors. Mechanics laughed about their weight and clumsiness. Veterans who'd flown earlier models spoke of them with something close to resignation. Set against the legendary Mitsubishi Zero, the Hellcat seemed impossibly outmatched. Everyone from experienced pilots to armchair strategists compared them unfavorably to nimble fighters that owned the skies above the ocean. Japanese aces like Saburo Sakai had already written off the Hellcat entirely. Easy prey, no match for the superior agility of the Zero. But Lieutenant Commander William Brown wasn't watching the Pacific dogfights from a ready room or officers' club. He was watching them from his desk at Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, sifting through combat reports and technical data, and he was beginning to see something nobody else had noticed. What if the real problem wasn't the airplane at all? What if the answer lay somewhere completely different? The propeller. That was his thought. And when he spoke it aloud, he knew exactly what the reaction would be. Every aviation expert in the country would say it was impossible. The Hellcat was already heavier than anyone wanted. The aircraft struggled under its own weight, adding a larger, bulkier propeller, the paddle blade design Brown was sketching. That would make everything worse. Or so conventional wisdom insisted. Every principle of fighter aircraft design stood against him. Every voice of experience, every calculation that had guided aircraft development for the past decade. Then came the first test flight. The modified Hellcat rose from the runway with power that nobody had anticipated. It climbed, not gradually, not adequately, but explosively. It rocketed upward, leaving the Mach Zeros behind in altitudes where they'd never been beaten before. In that moment, everything the aviation world believed about the Hellcat shattered like glass. But the story really began months earlier, when America's confidence lay in ruins. December 7, 1941, had torn through more than just the calm waters around Pearl Harbor. The attack had destroyed American certainty in their ability to match Japan's war machine. Smoke had still been rising from the wreckage in Honolulu when Brown found himself staring at combat reports across his desk at Grumman's Long Island facility. The reports painted a picture so grim it felt almost impossible to accept. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had become a legend overnight. Japanese pilots were cutting through American formations with precision that seemed almost surgical. Their fighters danced through the sky with agility that appeared almost supernatural. The Zero could turn on a dime. It climbed like a rocket. It outmaneuvered anything the United States Navy could put into the air. American pilots were dying. Their aircraft, particularly the new F-6F Hellcat, were being dismissed as flying coffins. Brown heard the whispers drifting through the corridors at Grumman's facility. The Hellcat was too heavy, too slow, too clumsy. Pilots who'd tested the early prototypes made comparisons that stung. It felt like an attractor with wings, over 11,000 pounds fully loaded, nearly 2,000 pounds heavier than the nimble Zero. Its thick wings and robust construction looked more like a freight hauler than a fighter. That was the fundamental problem. That was what everyone agreed on. The initial flight tests had confirmed their worst fears. The Hellcat struggled to match the Zero's climb rate. That was the most critical metric in aerial combat, and it was where the American fighter fell short. The problem seemed insurmountable because aviation engineers understood a basic equation that had guided their entire profession. Weight was the enemy. Weight destroyed performance. The Hellcat's designers had made their choice. They'd prioritized durability and firepower over agility, betting that American pilots could win through superior tactics and technology, rather than through pure dogfighting ability. That bet was failing catastrophically in the Pacific. William Brown was an unlikely candidate to solve this crisis. At 32 years old, he was younger than most senior engineers at Grumman, and he carried a reputation for unconventional thinking that made his colleagues nervous. His MIT degree had been followed by years spent not in prestigious aircraft design firms, but in industrial work. Pumps, turbines, unglamorous equipment that had taught him to think about power transmission in ways his aviation peers rarely understood. That background shaped everything that came next. The breakthrough arrived on a cold February morning in 1942. Brown was deep in performance data from Hamilton Standard's propeller division. The Hellcat carried a standard three-blade Curtiss electric propeller, 13 feet 2 inches in diameter, with relatively narrow chord blades. The same basic design philosophy that had equipped American fighters for over a decade. But something peculiar emerged from the test data. The propeller wasn't efficiently converting the Hellcat's massive Pratt and Whitney engine power into climb performance. The engine produced over 2,000 horsepower, more than enough to propel the Hellcat past any zero. But that power was being wasted. The narrow-blade propeller design created excessive slip at high power settings, particularly during the critical climb phase when pilots needed maximum performance. Brown realized that conventional wisdom about propeller efficiency had missed something fundamental. At least for an aircraft as powerful and heavy as the Hellcat, the rules didn't apply. The solution violated every established principle of fighter aircraft design. Brown proposed replacing the Hellcat's narrow-blade propeller with a massive paddle blade design featuring wider chord sections that could bite deeper into the air. The new propeller would be heavier. It would create more drag, and it would look absolutely enormous on the Hellcat's nose. Aviation experts who reviewed his preliminary calculations dismissed the idea immediately. Engineering fantasy. The resistance came from multiple directions, each one seemingly insurmountable. Aerodynamicists argued that the wider blades would create too much drag, reducing the Hellcat's top speed. Weight specialists calculated that the heavier propeller would push the aircraft's center of gravity dangerously forward. Even Hamilton Standard's own engineers expressed skepticism. Fighter aircraft had always prioritized lightweight, high-speed propeller designs. That was fundamental. But Brown had an ally. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Hamilton was a test pilot stationed at the Naval Air Test Center in Patuxent River, Maryland. Hamilton had flown early Hellcat prototypes and experienced firsthand their disappointing climb performance. Unlike many test pilots focused on handling characteristics, Hamilton understood the tactical implications. In combat, a fighter that couldn't climb quickly was a dead fighter. He saw the problem clearly. The first test installation took place in March of 1942. The installation team used a modified Hamilton Standard hydromatic propeller with significantly wider blade sections. They worked through the night, carefully balancing the new propeller and adjusting the engine mount to compensate for the changed weight distribution. When dawn broke over Long Island, the modified Hellcat sat on the runway looking distinctly different. Its massive propeller gave the aircraft an almost comical appearance. Hamilton climbed into the cockpit for the first flight with nervous anticipation. The taxi test had shown that the wider blades created more torque during engine startup, requiring more rudder input to keep the aircraft tracking straight. But as Hamilton advanced the throttle for takeoff, something remarkable happened. The Hellcat leaped from the runway with acceleration unlike anything he'd experienced in this aircraft before. The climb test began at 2,000 feet. Hamilton followed standard protocols for measuring rate of climb at various altitudes. At 5,000 feet, the modified Hellcat was climbing at over 3,000 feet per minute, nearly double the performance of the standard propeller installation. At 10,000 feet, where the thin air usually sapped climbing power, the wide-blade propeller continued pulling the heavy fighter skyward with authority. Hamilton's radio crackled with excitement as he reported the results back to Brown and the engineering team. The impossible had happened. The heavier, dragier propeller had transformed the clumsy Hellcat into a climbing machine. But the real test would come in actual combat. Split-second advantages in climb rate meant the difference between life and death. The implications were staggering. If the wide-blade propeller could give the Hellcat a decisive climbing advantage, American pilots would no longer need to fear the Zero's legendary agility. They could climb above their opponents, control the engagement, and fight on their own terms. The flying tractor might just become the deadliest weapon in the Pacific sky. By June of 1942, the Pacific War had become a graveyard for American pilots and their aircraft. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May had shown that American carriers could fight the Japanese to a draw, but individual dogfights still belonged to the Zero. Lieutenant Thomas Williams had survived his first encounter with Saburo Sakai's squadron over the Solomon Islands, but barely. His F-4F Wildcat had taken 14 bullet holes. Williams himself carried shrapnel in his left shoulder that Navy doctors said would never fully heal. The Hellcat program was supposed to change everything, but production delays and design problems were mounting. Grumman's factory on Long Island was churning out aircraft with the standard narrow-blade propellers, while Brown's paddle blade modification remained buried in engineering reports. Navy procurement officers, under intense pressure to get fighters to the Pacific Fleet, were reluctant to delay production for what they viewed as an unproven experiment. Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell commanded Task Force 58 and needed results immediately. His carrier-based fighter squadrons were losing experienced pilots faster than training programs could replace them. The Mitsubishi Zero's grip on Pacific air combat extended far beyond mere tactics. It had infected American pilots with something far more insidious, a creeping fear that undermined even the most seasoned warriors. Flight surgeons had begun documenting what they quietly referred to as zero fever, a debilitating condition that could strike even the most trained and courageous pilots the moment they glimpsed those distinctive elliptical wings and heard the roar of that radial engine through their headsets. Frank Brown's revolutionary propeller might have become nothing more than a forgotten engineering curiosity, if not for a fortunate meeting at the Naval Air Test Center during late June. Commander John Thack, the brilliant tactician behind the legendary Thack-Weave formation, had come to Patuxent River to assess emerging fighter tactics. Hamilton seized the opportunity, persuading Thack to witness a demonstration flight featuring the Hellcat equipped with Brown's experimental paddle blade propeller. He understood that a combat veteran's assessment carried weight that no engineer's report ever could. From the control tower, Thack observed as Hamilton took the modified aircraft through a series of aggressive climbing maneuvers that replicated actual combat conditions. The transformation was unmistakable. A standard Hellcat, when pushed into a steep climb, would hemorrhage speed until it stalled or wallowed helplessly. But Hamilton's machine maintained its authority throughout the vertical assault, power flowing steadily through every turn. The wide blade was harnessing the tremendous torque of the R2800 engine, channeling it into something revolutionary, raw climbing capability. Thack grasped the implications immediately. Pacific fighter combat had always been about one fundamental principle: who controlled the altitude, who maintained airspeed, who held position. The Zero had reigned supreme because it could claw skyward faster than anything the Americans flew, forcing them into a constant struggle playing defense from below. But if a Hellcat could climb faster, that equation would invert entirely. Thack's assessment to Admiral Mitchell proved succinct and powerful. His recommendation cut through bureaucratic hesitation like a knife. Within 2 days, emergency orders cascaded through the production pipeline. The first combat-ready units would be operational by August. The fighter squadron designated VF-15, stationed aboard the USS Yorktown, received the honor of fielding the first operational paddle-blade Hellcats. The squadron's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, had nursed doubts about the Hellcat from its inception. The smaller F-4F Wildcat remained his preference, despite its anemic firepower and limited range. Yet after his first flight in a paddle-blade-equipped machine, everything changed in an instant. The sensation was unlike anything in his experience. The aircraft surged upward with tremendous vigor, the wide propeller hauling the heavy fighter Skywire Dumwa at velocities that startled even veteran pilots. At altitudes where fighters typically gasped for breath, this machine continued its relentless climb with undiminished muscle. Training exercises throughout August revealed Brown's innovation in its full glory. Mock engagements pitting paddle-blade Hellcats against captured Japanese aircraft demonstrated a reversal so complete it seemed almost fictional. American pilots no longer needed to match the Zero in a twisting fight where the lighter Japanese machine held every advantage. Instead, they could climb above their opponents, establish superior position, and attack from strength. The psychological shift proved equally revolutionary as the performance gains. Ensign Thomas Williams, gradually recovering from his earlier injuries, but determined to return to the fight, transitioned into the paddle blade variant among the first group of pilots. Months of dreading Zero encounters, knowing his aircraft suffered from fundamental disadvantages, suddenly evaporated. Strapped into his new Hellcat's cockpit, feeling the massive propeller claw through the air with unprecedented authority, Williams rediscovered an emotion that had abandoned him since that terrible day in December. Confidence. Real, substantive confidence. The Pacific War's first true test of Brown's innovation came during the clash at the Santa Cruz Islands that October. VF-15 launched from the Yorktown with a dozen paddle-blade Hellcats, assigned to defend the American task force. Lieutenant Sakai commanded the opposing Zero Squadron, a veteran formation of experienced pilots. He approached the engagement assuming his usual advantages would hold. He would climb above them, choose his prey, and descend to attack with overwhelming superiority. But the Hellcats climbed faster. Williams, flying as wingman, watched his altitude indicator climb past 20,000 feet, while the Zeros below struggled to match their ascent rate. The Pacific War had reached an inflection point. American fighters now held the altitude advantage over Japan's legendary machine. The psychological dynamic had flipped completely. When combat erupted, the Zeros discovered themselves pressed into unfamiliar disadvantage. Sakai, accustomed to orchestrating engagements from above, found himself defending instead. The paddle blade propeller granted American pilots not merely superior climbing ability, but tactical dominance. They controlled when engagements occurred, where they would fight, how the battle would develop. The scoreboard told the essential story. VF-15 destroyed 8 Zeros while absorbing only 2 losses, a kill ratio that would have been unthinkable with standard propellers. American pilots rotated home with something more precious than confirmed kills. They possessed renewed belief that they had finally acquired an aircraft capable of challenging the Zero on equal terms. Brown's audacious engineering trick had reshaped not just individual aircraft performance, but the entire strategic character of Pacific air warfare. The cumbersome flying truck had metamorphosed into a lethal flying hunter. Japanese aviators would soon confront a bitter truth. American technical innovation could prove as destructive as any conventional weapon. The massive carrier engagement across the Mariana Islands on June 19, 1944, erupted before sunrise as history's largest naval battle took shape. Vice Admiral Mitchell commanded Task Force 58, an enormous armada comprising 15 aircraft carriers and more than 900 aircraft, with over 400 equipped with Brown's wide-blade propellers. The approaching Japanese fleet under Admiral Ozawa possessed 9 carriers and 430 aircraft, carrying pilots that believed their veteran Zero crews could still dominate in close combat. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, flying despite the lingering effects from his 1942 wounds that had stolen much of his vision, still commanded a Zero squadron. Intelligence briefings suggested the new American fighters represented only marginal improvements, minor modifications to the sluggish machines his pilots had been destroying for 2 years. Japanese aviation authorities dismissed climbing performance claims as American propaganda, insisting that fundamental aerodynamic laws made such dramatic improvements impossible without complete redesign. At dawn's first light, Sakai led 18 Zeros toward the American fleet. The tactical approach remained unchanged from countless prior engagements: establish altitude superiority, identify vulnerable American aircraft, exploit the diving speed and agility advantages that had defined the entire Pacific campaign. Sakai's pilots carried the confidence of veterans, certain their aircraft and their abilities would prove decisive. Commander David McCampbell, directing Air Group 15 from the USS Essex, scrambled 36 Hellcats to intercept. McCampbell had been among the first squadron commanders to fully absorb the tactical transformation created by Brown's innovation. His pilots had trained relentlessly in vertical combat techniques, mastering how to exploit their superior climbing power to control every aspect of the engagement. Radar picked up the Japanese formation at 0730 hours, positioned at 90 miles distant and climbing steadily through 15,000 feet. McCampbell ordered his Hellcats to maximum climbing power immediately, understanding that whoever controlled altitude would determine the battle's outcome. The wide propellers bit into increasingly thin air with remarkable efficiency, hauling the American fighters skyward at rates that shattered Japanese expectations. Ensign Williams, now a veteran credited with 12 confirmed kills, flew within McCampbell's formation. Williams had survived those dark early months when American pilots had struggled desperately in obviously inferior aircraft against vastly superior opposition. The transformation delivered by Brown's propeller represented something deeply personal: the difference between defensive survival and aggressive dominance, between merely enduring and genuinely winning. At 22,000 feet, McCampbell's Hellcats achieved visual contact with Sakai's formation still climbing toward what the Japanese pilots anticipated would be their altitude stronghold. The Americans, however, continued climbing past their opponents, reaching 28,000 feet before leveling off in perfect attacking position above them. Sakai faced a shock he had never experienced in his combat career. American fighters had outclimbed his Zeros. The emotional impact registered immediately and severely across the Japanese formation. Pilots who had spent 3 years controlling engagements from above suddenly confronted unfamiliar defensive positions. Sakai's radio transmission received confused, anxious reports from his pilots, struggling to comprehend how those heavy American fighters had achieved superior altitude despite their later launch and identical climb through the same atmosphere. McCampbell's assault unfolded with textbook precision, diving from 28,000 feet with tremendous kinetic energy advantage. The paddle-blade Hellcats accelerated through the dive with powerful authority, their wide propellers converting gravity into devastating speed. Williams targeted a Zero, attempting to escape the diving assault, aware that his aircraft's raw power would sustain his attack position throughout whatever maneuver followed. The turning engagement that erupted demonstrated the complete inversion of Pacific air combat dynamics. Zeros that had once wielded superior agility to evade and counterattack now found themselves unable to escape Hellcats, capable of matching their turning performance while retaining superior energy reserves. The wide-blade propellers offered more than merely enhanced climbing. They provided uninterrupted power during the violent maneuvering that left Japanese pilots exhausted defending their positions. Sakai engaged Williams in a vertical climbing duel that would have seemed impossible mere years before. The Zero pilot attempted his familiar climbing maneuver, expecting the heavy American aircraft to stall or lose power, just as Wildcats and earlier Hellcats had done so many times previously. Instead, Williams' Hellcat climbed alongside him, the enormous propeller harvesting every ounce of the R2800 engine's power and converting it into vertical performance that matched, then exceeded, the Zero's storied abilities. The engagement consumed less than 10 minutes, yet its consequences reshaped Pacific War strategy entirely. McCampbell's squadron destroyed 29 Japanese aircraft while suffering only 2 losses, a kill ratio approaching 15-1 that would have remained impossible without Brown's climbing performance innovation. The broader engagement produced identical results throughout Task Force 58, with American pilots destroying more than 400 Japanese aircraft in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Lieutenant Sakai escaped with his life, but piloted a severely damaged aircraft toward a Japanese-held island where he ditched in the ocean. Floating in his rescue raft, observing American Hellcats patrolling overhead with absolute freedom, Sakai confronted an unavoidable reality. The entire character of the war had fundamentally transformed. The Zero's reign had come to an end, not through dramatic breakthroughs in aircraft design, but through something far more elegant: a single engineering modification that had transformed ordinary American fighters into lethal machines. The Philippine Sea engagement revealed just how completely Brown's vision had altered everything. Japanese naval aviation lay in ruins. The pilots were gone. The experienced flyers who had once commanded the skies were either dead or recovering from wounds they would never fully heal from. Without replacement pilots and aircraft to replenish their decimated squadrons, Japan could no longer sustain carrier operations anywhere across the Pacific. American fighters now possessed capabilities the Japanese could only dream of. They climbed faster. They fought longer. They dominated every engagement, turning battles that had once gone either way into complete American victories. Brown received word of the triumph while sitting at his desk in Long Island, surrounded by technical drawings and performance charts. He was analyzing data, sketching improvements, always looking ahead. The man his colleagues had once dismissed as a visionary crank had created the very weapon that had ended Japanese air superiority across an entire ocean. One modification to a propeller, that's all it took. Those paddle-shaped blades had performed a miracle, converting clumsy flying trucks into the most feared fighter aircraft in the world. The myth that the Zero was invincible lay shattered in the waters beneath. American pilots no longer dreaded seeing that distinctive Japanese silhouette approaching them. Their Hellcats could outclimb anything the Japanese launched. They could outfight it. They could outlast it. The psychological shift was as complete as the tactical one. But victory brought unexpected complications. As 1944 drew toward winter, American confidence bred complacency. Kill ratios favored American pilots so overwhelmingly that some senior Navy officers began wondering whether the expensive paddle blade program was still necessary. Each wide-chord propeller cost 3 times what a standard design ran. Manufacturing delays from the complex machining were stacking up, slowing fighter deliveries. Budget-conscious analysts saw a program running too smoothly, producing aircraft so dominant that questions arose about its continued value. Admiral Ernest King, commanding all naval operations, ordered a review board assembled in November. The group included skeptics who'd opposed Brown's work from the beginning, engineers pushing to return to simpler designs, and procurement specialists worried about runaway costs. Their preliminary conclusions suggested that American pilot training and better tactics, rather than propeller modifications, had truly shifted the balance. Brown faced the same institutional resistance that had nearly killed his program years earlier. The data supporting his innovation was overwhelming. Paddle blade Hellcats consistently outperformed standard aircraft in every meaningful way. Climb rates, turn performance, energy management during combat. The engineering was clear. The review board ignored it, focusing instead on spreadsheets and manufacturing costs. Everything shifted when Lieutenant Commander Hamilton presented combat evaluation data comparing paddle blade Hellcats to Japan's newest fighter development. Intelligence indicated the Japanese were building the Kawanishi N1KJ Shiden, a land-based interceptor specifically designed to counter American bomber formations. Early encounters with prototypes suggested something different from the Zero, something that might actually match the Hellcat's performance in certain altitude bands. The Shiden was everything the Zero wasn't: heavy, powerful, built for high-altitude interception rather than the dogfighting nimbleness that had characterized earlier Japanese design. Its Nakajima Homar engine produced nearly 2,000 horsepower, matching the Hellcat's own R2800. Shorter, broader wings gave it excellent climbing performance without sacrificing high-speed stability. Japanese test pilots reported it could outclimb standard Hellcats above 25,000 feet, potentially neutralizing the altitude advantage that had become central to American fighter tactics. Commander McCampbell, now the Navy's leading ace with 34 confirmed kills, flew the first evaluation mission against the Shiden in December over the Philippines. His squadron encountered 6 N1KJ aircraft defending a Japanese airfield near Manila. Both formations climbed toward the altitude band, where decisive advantages lay waiting. McCampbell's paddle blade-equipped Hellcats initially outclimbed their opponents through the critical 15 to 20,000 foot zone where most battles occurred. But above 25,000 feet, something unexpected happened. The Shidens began matching their climb rates, then surpassing them. Williams, promoted to lieutenant and flying as McCampbell's wingman, found himself in a climbing duel with a Shiden pilot whose skills matched any Zero ace he'd encountered. The Japanese fighter's high-altitude performance was genuinely impressive, maintaining excellent maneuverability while climbing at rates that challenged even paddle blade-equipped Hellcats. But the engagement exposed a critical vulnerability in Japanese fighter development that Brown's modification had cleverly exploited without anyone realizing it. The Shiden's superior high-altitude performance came at a terrible price. Mediocre effectiveness at lower altitudes where most Pacific air battles actually happened. Below 20,000 feet, where the wide-chord propeller design reached its peak efficiency, McCampbell's Hellcats possessed decisive advantages. Acceleration that the Japanese couldn't match, climbing ability they couldn't counter, turn performance that left Scheiden's behind. The fight descended through altitude bands, and the imbalance grew more pronounced with every 1,000 feet they dropped. Scheiden pilots who'd matched the Hellcats at 28,000 feet became increasingly outmatched as combat maneuvering brought both sides lower. Williams deliberately drew his opponent into descending engagements, exploiting the altitude-dependent performance advantage that the paddle blade propeller provided at medium and low altitudes. McCampbell's after-action report confirmed what Brown had understood from the beginning. The paddle blade modification's greatest strength wasn't superior performance at any single altitude, but consistent effectiveness across every altitude where real combat occurred. Specialized interceptors, like the Scheiden, might achieve tactical parity in narrow altitude bands, but they couldn't maintain that advantage throughout the constantly shifting multi-altitude environment of actual aerial warfare. The review board's final January meeting weighed McCampbell's combat evaluation against production cost analyses and assessments of remaining Japanese aviation capabilities. Brown presented updated performance data. Paddle blade Hellcats had achieved kill ratios exceeding 19-1 against all Japanese aircraft types, including their newest interceptors. More importantly, American pilot casualties had dropped to historically low levels, preserving the experienced aviators needed for the final assault on Japan itself. Admiral King's decision came after reviewing casualty reports demonstrating the paddle blade program's impact on pilot survival. The modification had saved American lives by providing pilots with decisive advantages during the moments when they needed them most. Manufacturing costs for complex propellers were trivial compared to the expense of training replacement pilots and maintaining experienced air crews. Production orders weren't just continued, but expanded. Hamilton Standard received contracts to equip every carrier-based fighter the Navy deployed across the Pacific. Brown's innovation received complete institutional acceptance, transforming from desperate experiment into the standard configuration for American naval aviation. Final vindication arrived during the Okinawa campaign in April, when paddle blade-equipped Hellcats faced the largest and most determined kamikaze attacks of the entire Pacific War. Japanese pilots flying Zeros and the latest Scheidens pressed their attacks against American fighter screens, protecting the invasion fleet. The Hellcat's superior climbing ability allowed them to intercept incoming attacks at maximum range, destroying kamikaze aircraft before they reached vulnerable ships. Brown's impossible propeller trick had evolved from an engineering curiosity into the very foundation of American air superiority over Japan. Those wide-chord blades that skeptics had once dismissed as impractical now equipped the fighters escorting B-29 bombers over Japanese cities and providing air cover for the planned invasion of the home islands. And one engineer's refusal to accept conventional limitations had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Pacific War. The atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, ended everything before paddle blade Hellcats could participate in the invasion of Japan. Sudden peace created unexpected problems. What happened to hundreds of pilots and aircraft optimized for a conflict that no longer existed? Many aviation experts questioned whether such specialized fighters had any place in a post-war world. Brown faced an uncertain future as Grumman's wartime contracts disappeared and the company transitioned to peacetime production. The engineer who'd revolutionized carrier-based fighter design discovered his expertise suddenly seemed antiquated. Jet engines were replacing piston power plants. Guided missiles were making traditional dogfighting obsolete. The paddle blade propeller that had seemed revolutionary in 1942 looked primitive compared to turbojet engines, powering experimental aircraft like the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star. Lieutenant Williams, decorated ace with 19 confirmed kills, struggled with the transition to civilian life after discharge in September 1945. The confidence and tactical knowledge he'd developed flying paddle blade Hellcats proved difficult to translate into peacetime careers. Like thousands of other combat veterans, Williams found himself nostalgic for wartime service's clarity and purpose. Every mission had obvious objectives and measurable results. The first indication that Brown's innovation might have enduring impact came during the Korean War, when the Navy desperately needed carrier-based fighters capable of operating from aging World War II flight decks. New F-9F Panther jets required longer runways and more complex support equipment than many carriers could accommodate. The Navy reactivated mothballed Hellcat squadrons for close air support missions over the Korean peninsula. Commander McCampbell, recalled to active duty training Korean war pilots, discovered something remarkable. Paddle-blade-equipped Hellcats performed exceptionally well in ground attack roles. Those wide-chord propellers that had provided climbing advantages in air-to-air combat delivered superior acceleration during low-altitude strike missions, allowing Hellcat pilots to escape anti-aircraft fire more effectively than jets operating at similar altitudes and speeds. The irony wasn't lost on Brown. He designed his modification specifically to counter the Zero in high-altitude dogfights. Korean War Hellcats were now using that same technology, attacking ground targets in support of United Nations forces, proving that innovative engineering solutions often found applications far beyond their original intended purpose. True vindication came through careful analysis of Pacific War combat records that revealed the broader strategic impact of the paddle-blade program. Naval historians discovered that Hellcat squadrons, equipped with wide-chord propellers, hadn't just achieved superior kill ratios. They'd fundamentally altered Japanese strategic planning throughout the final 2 years of the conflict. Japanese aviation planners, facing consistent reports of American fighters that could outclimb their best interceptors, had been forced to abandon offensive carrier operations and concentrate on defensive tactics that played to American strengths rather than Japanese advantages. The psychological impact of the Hellcat's climbing performance had proven as important as its tactical effectiveness, convincing Japanese commanders they could no longer compete with American aviation technology. Admiral Metzger, writing his post-war memoirs, described the paddle-blade modification as the single most important technological innovation of the Pacific Air Campaign. That improved climbing performance had enabled tactical doctrines maximizing American advantages while minimizing Japanese strengths. Fighter sweeps clearing enemy interceptors from the skies. Bomber escorts maintaining protective formations throughout long-range missions. Close air support operations responding rapidly to changing ground situations, all made possible by the altitude advantage Brown's propellers provided. The paddle-blade program's influence extended far beyond World War II aviation. Propeller manufacturers studying Brown's design principles developed variable pitch and contra-rotating systems, improving efficiency across numerous aircraft types. Helicopter designers adapted wide-chord blade concepts to improve lifting performance. Wind turbine engineers applied similar principles, increasing electrical generation efficiency. Williams eventually found his post-war calling as a test pilot for civilian aircraft manufacturers, where experience with paddle-blade Hellcats proved invaluable evaluating prototype designs. The tactical thinking he'd developed during combat, analyzing performance trade-offs, understanding energy management, recognizing the difference between theoretical capabilities and operational effectiveness, translated directly to peacetime aviation development. Brown continued working for Grumman through the jet age, contributing to designs ranging from the F-14 Tomcat fighter to the lunar module landing on the Moon in 1969. His engineering approach, emphasizing practical solutions over theoretical elegance, became embedded in Grumman's corporate culture, influencing generations of aerospace engineers who never knew their problem-solving methods originated with a paddle-blade propeller. Hellcats themselves had varied post-war fates. Many were sold to Allied nations, where they served as frontline fighters well into the 1950s, their climbing performance remaining competitive against early jet aircraft in certain operational scenarios. Others were converted to civilian use, their powerful engines and robust construction making them popular for air racing and aerobatic competition. Lieutenant Sakai, the Japanese ace who'd survived encounters with paddle-blade-equipped Hellcats, immigrated to the United States in 1952. He and Williams eventually met at an aviation reunion in 1967. The two former enemies discovered they shared professional respect for the aircraft that had dominated their wartime experiences. Sakai acknowledged that the Hellcat's climbing performance had fundamentally changed his understanding of fighter tactics. By the time Brown retired from Grumman in 1975, his paddle blade modification had largely faded from public memory, overshadowed by more dramatic wartime developments like radar, jet propulsion, and guided missiles. Within the aviation engineering community, his work remained influential as an example of how seemingly simple modifications could produce revolutionary improvements in aircraft performance. Soviet aviation archives, released after the Cold War, provided unexpected final assessment of Brown's achievement. Russian engineers had attempted reverse engineering captured paddle blade propellers throughout the 1940s and 50s. Their failure to understand the subtle design principles making Brown's innovation effective had contributed to persistent problems with Soviet propeller-driven fighters, continuing until jet propulsion made the entire technology obsolete. The impossible propeller trick that had transformed a clumsy flying truck into the dominant fighter of the Pacific War had proven that individual innovation could change history's course. One engineer, one idea, one blade at a time.